Hello, my name is Irene Hoffmann. I'm the Secretary of the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Okay, yes, thank you for this question. Genetic resources for food and agriculture are the basis of our food security. They have been developed by farmers, for plant and animal genetic resources. There is a very long history of domestication, and these resources have been developed by the farmers and the livestock keepers for many generations, so they have developed specific traits that allow them to adapt to very specific production environments, be it very dry, be it very wet, with long vegetation periods, short vegetation periods, whatever you imagine. And that gives you the broad base for selecting for future needs. If consumers change their dietary needs, if there is climate change, if anything else happens, you have this broad diversity in the material that you can draw upon to breed something new. The situation is slightly different for aquatic genetic resources and forest genetic resources, because in those sectors the majority of diversity is still in the wild. Particularly in forest genetic resources, 90% of all the forests are not cultivated, they are not managed by humans, they are in the wild. And for forest we have about 60,000 different tree species, and only about 2,400 are commercially used by humans somehow, and only 700 have some sort of breeding program. So this is only starting. Forest breeding, it's a very young science. There are close links between forest breeding and what is going on in the conservation in botanical gardens, or provenance tests where you take forest species from one location in another and see how they develop, and then you can see whether this is suitable for future breeding. In all species it's really the task to maintain all this diversity. If we cannot conserve it in situ, in the wild habitats, we have to conserve it in a gene bank, in a live gene bank, or in cryoconservation, and then to link what we have characterized to breeding programs. FAO does forest monitoring. We do a forest resource assessment every 2 years that shows the decline in forests or the increase in forests, and also it identifies the main sources of deforestation and forest degradation. It also changes our view on forest, because traditionally, people think a forest is a very dense cluster of trees. But for example, a recent FAO assessment for drylands found that there are more trees in drylands outside of forest than inside of forest. So you need to reconsider your image of forest and forest landscapes and broaden it up, because a forest, which is a forest in the traditional sense, and which is the majority of forests, of course, they are a dense number of trees and very important sources of biodiversity, particularly in the Amazonian forest or the Congo Basin forest. But you also have this diversity and the interaction with other with agriculture, with livestock and so on in these in the areas with lower densities of trees, and they also need to be maintained, and there is also degradation, forest degradation. So monitoring gives us the overview of all of this, what is happening in spatial terms. It also gives us, if we combine this with other GIS methods, areas of, let's say, certain climate hotspots or changes where we would expect to find a very high diversity of forest genetic material, and which we could then use for target selection, collection and then selection of what we may need for future breeding. It also then allows us to see what we can use for forest rehabilitation, because it's very important that forest rehabilitation is not with imported species, not pine and eucalyptus and these species everywhere, but that you do rejuvenation of forest and restoration of forest with native species. And a lot of research has to be done there, because lots of forest species have recalcitrant seeds, and you need to really treat them specially to make them germinate, and this requires much more research. And then you need to involve the local populations in these exercises, because when you do rehabilitation and restoration of landscapes, these trees need to be watered, and somebody has to take care of the trees when they are very young. And once they are established, you have a much safer, re-established forest. And then, for example, FAO is doing that. There is a project which is linked to climate change, the Great Green Wall of the Sahel, where we are really restoring degraded forests along the Sahel to block the advance of the desert and to rehabilitate not only the forest but also the other ecosystems. I think one challenge is that the science is relatively new, and that we are dealing with a lot of wild species which we still have to characterize and then find out how we can actually breed them and deal with the more difficult ones, the difficult reproductive patterns, and not only go for the easy ones. And in forest management and forest restoration, really focus on adaptability of native species and rejuvenation of a forest that is mixed biologically and gives a lot of adaptation potential to climate change, for example. And because lots of forests are in communal lands, it's also very important to include the indigenous societies and communities in the management of the forest, and have land tenure and access rights that empowers them to manage the forest in a responsible way. And then to develop the technologies of forest conservation and exchange of specimens across different ecosystems, because that's what we will need in view of climate change. I think, what I want to add, the last state of forest resources of FAO showed the close linkage between agriculture and forestry. And therefore it is important that also at national level there is a discussion between the Ministry of Forestry and the Ministry of Agriculture about the sources, the causes of forest degradation, and also using the potential that exists in agriculture for reforestation. For example, creating silvopastoral systems and agro-silvopastoral systems and so on, to create really networks, biological corridors and landscape structures of forest within landscapes.